Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Stop. Welcome back to Brainworms.
My name is Joe.
Can you tell we're trying something new? I'm Paola. And welcome back to Brainworms. I realized that we never introduce ourselves. Partially because I think only our friends and family listen to our podcast. So they know who we are. But there might be other people. You don't know. So welcome to the podcast, or welcome back. This is a podcast about the things that we can't stop thinking about in our normal lives as partners and living together and all of that. We like to info dump on each other. So we started a podcast to do that. And info dump to you guys also. So we hope you enjoy the episode. Today we have some interesting topics. I think I go first this time. Okay, so this week I'm going to talk about something that's actually really topical and something we just watched and I have sort of been thinking about since we stopped watching it, and that is the Oscars, aka the Academy Awards. Or I guess it's the Academy Awards. It doesn't matter, whatever. The official name is the Academy Awards. After we finished watching last week, I sort of had a lot of questions about it. So I was trying to get those questions answered. I'll start with how the Oscars ceremony began. The Oscars are actually run by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which was founded in 1927. And at the time that the Oscars started, there were actually a lot of things going on in Hollywood. There were labor disputes, and there was also pressure from the actors who were wanting to unionize. And there were also a lot of public scandals involving the actors and studios, and there was a lot of drama. So the executives basically decided to start an award ceremony to sort of clean up Hollywood's image and also create prestige around the industry to make it special, and also to turn it into this is going to be a night where we recognize, the movies that are being made, and, basically make it like a fancy affair. The Oscars have in that way been a celebration of art, but they've also been kind of a strategic move on the part of the Hollywood industry. So the first ceremony actually took place in 1929 at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, and it was actually a very low-key ceremony compared to now. Now it's all glitz and glamour and everything. There were only about 270 people there. And also the tickets to attend were only $5. I don't know how much how much they cost now, but I think from what I saw on the website, it said $5, which would be $90 now. But still, I'll pay $90 to go to the Oscars. So the whole thing was very low key, and it was basically like a private dinner. That was kind of more the vibe of it. Also, the whole thing lasted 15 minutes. That's it. There was the actual awards ceremony part was 15 minutes. And then of course they had a party after, but the actual awards was only 15 minutes, which is crazy, especially compared to now. I think this last one was over 3 hours or something. It's crazy. Also, there was obviously there was no red carpet, there was no press spectacle, there were no dramatic speeches. It was very, very basic. Also, there was no suspense. Everybody knew who the winners were going to be. They were actually announced months in advance. And so there wasn't even the element of surprise. It was literally just the most straightforward thing, very different than now for sure. Obviously, with the first ceremony being in 1929, it was not televised because TV wasn't a thing yet. So it just kind of happened and whatever, and it wasn't until 1953 that the very first Oscars were broadcast and they were on television. So the next thing that I was wondering when we were watching last week was why they're called the Oscars, and there's a few stories, and I don't know if any of them are confirmed, but when I looked into it, there were a few theories out there. So obviously, officially, everyone knows it's actually called the Academy Awards, but obviously they're also known as the Oscars, and they have been for a very long time. So one of the most popular origin stories that I came across was that a lady named Margaret Herrick, who was the librarian and president of the Academy, said that the statuette looked like her uncle Oscar, and then it just kind of stuck. So that's one of the theories out there. I don't know if it has been confirmed or not. I couldn't find something solidly saying like, yes, this is true. The other theory that I came across in my research was that columnist Sidney Skolsky said that he came up with the term in 1934 when he was under pressure for a deadline. He said it came from mocking vaudeville comedians who asked, "Will you have a cigar, Oscar?" I don't know what that means, but whatever. And he actually was, I think the thing that is true is that he was the first person who wrote it in print. Like, that was the first time it appeared in print, was this particular columnist who called it the Oscars. So I don't know if that means that he came up with it or that he heard it somewhere else and then he wrote it. So that's one of the other origin stories. There's a few others floating around, but not, like I said earlier, nothing that seems like actually concrete that everyone can agree on. But by 1939, it was kind of accepted and like it basically stuck, like the name stuck. So I also wanted to talk about some of the controversies that have happened throughout the history of the Oscars. Some of them are more recent, some of them are a little bit older. So yeah, I wanted to sort of like go through them and talk about them. The first one I have here is in around 2015, 2016, when the like hashtag Oscars so white, movement started, where people were very critical of the fact that all of the 20 acting nominees that year were all white. And it obviously, it meant something bigger, I think it got to the point where people couldn't overlook it. So there was a lot of public backlash, people boycotting the Oscars, and it became a huge thing. Ultimately, it did end up, making some change, because after that, the Academy started inviting like more diverse voters. So it had an impact, but obviously it kind of sucks that it had to get to that for change like that to happen. But that was a big one for sure. Another kind of political moment was actually in 1973 when Marlon Brando refused to accept his Oscar, and he actually sent a Native American activist in his place to like accept it for him, to protest, the representation of Native Americans in Hollywood. A more recent memorable moment from the Oscars was in 2017, Envelope Gate, when, La La Land is announced as the Best Picture winner by Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty. And they go up and they are, of course, like pumped. They're really excited. They're like, we did it. And they go up and give their speeches. It's like the whole crew in the background. They get pretty far into speeches, I will say. I think at least 3 people, because I went back and I rewatched it. At least like 3 people gave like very heartfelt speeches. And then you can see a tech come up and with like a headset and be like, give me the envelope and like look at it and see that there was a mistake. And Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty were given, it looked like 2 cards inside one envelope, and one of them said Emma Stone, because she won for Best Actress for La La Land. And so they saw La La Land and they read, well, I think it was Faye Dunaway, like she read out La La Land. So they thought La La Land was the winner. And once the tech goes up to the stage and is like, no, like, look, this is the actual card. Then actually one of the I think it's one of the producers of La La Land is like, actually Moonlight won, and then Moonlight gets to go up and have their moment. But it was definitely very unexpected, pretty awkward. Everybody, you could like, they kept getting like shots of the audience and everything, and everyone's like, ooh, like what is happening? So that was pretty crazy moment. I think they were trying to sabotage the presenters. Who knows?
It was an attack against Warren Beatty.
It was. I think
Okay.
so.
Who has a grudge against Warren Beatty?
I don't know. We'll have to. We can crack the case though. I think.
We'll have to do some investigating.
The next memorable moment also happened recently in 2022. The slap. So that year, while he was presenting an award, Chris Rock was on stage and he was like trying to be funny. He was like riffing, whatever. And at one point, he makes a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith, comparing her shaved head to G.I. Jane, just because like her head was shaved. I don't know. The context of the situation, which it was not apparent to anyone, or like it was not an obvious thing, was that actually Jada Pinkett Smith has alopecia, and she's been really open about like talking about it. So like maybe some people knew, maybe some people didn't, and it just didn't land well, obviously. And when he first said the joke, like the cameras cut to Will Smith and Jada, and Will Smith was kind of like laughing, but Jada looked pissed. Like she looked really, really pissed. So after that happened, Will Smith went up to Chris Rock and slapped him in the face. Like not a little slap, like a big fat slap. And everyone was like quiet. Like you could freaking hear a pin drop. It was wild. And of course, he goes back to sit down and he's like, keep my wife's name out of your mouth, out of your fucking mouth, I think is what he says, to be exact. And it was just really, really, really awkward. Really awkward. It was awkward to watch at home. I can only imagine how awkward it was for the people that were actually there. And then later on in the night, Will Smith actually won for Best Actor, and he had to go up and like give a speech and everything. And he was apologetic. He was like, he apologized to the Academy. He talked about, you know, wanting to protect his family and everything, but he did not apologize to Chris Rock. So I think he has since, like, after, like, way after, but it was definitely a very tense and, like, memorable moment in the history of the Oscars. Like, nobody's going to forget about that. It was crazy.
Just some added context that I remember sort of surfaced because of this event was that it was basically revealed that Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith were having a hard time. They were like semi separated, and she kind of had a boyfriend.
Yeah, I
Or
can't remember
something.
now if that happened before or after or when in the timeline of things, but I think it's definitely fair to say that their marriage was volatile, maybe.
Right. Rocky. Chris Rocky.
Oh, also, by the way, Will Smith is banned from the Oscars for like 10 years, I think. So, yeah. Moving on from that, from the drama, I also was curious about which movie or movies have won the most Oscars ever. And it's actually a tie between three of them. It's Ben-Hur, classic movie, Titanic, because obviously, and then you'll be happy about this one, or maybe you already know, Lord of the Rings, Return of the King.
Nice.
Yeah, I knew you would be happy about that one. Return of the King actually is especially iconic because it literally won every single nomination that it had. Like, it was nominated for 11 things, it won 11 things.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty wild. As far as like records go, also to this day, Walt Disney holds the most Oscars ever. He had 22 Oscars and 59 nominations. So that's also a big deal. And also in 2020, Parasite became the first non-English movie to win for Best Picture, which was also a really big deal because um historically, you know, international films have always been like in their own category. So, yeah, that's also a really big deal. And that movie is really good, so makes sense. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some Oscar snubs. One of them is actually the fact that Citizen Kane lost for Best Picture. It's a big deal because that is widely regarded as one of the best movies ever. So it actually lost. So Alfred Hitchcock actually never won for Best Director. which is kind of crazy too, because he had such a like long career, and his movies are like highly regarded, especially when it comes to like innovations in filmmaking and directing. And so I'm like, what happened there? He never won. Also, Stanley Kubrick was nominated 4 times, but he actually never won either, which is kind of wild. Another one that is a more recent one was, which I didn't know about because I've never seen this movie. Brokeback Mountain was nominated for Best Picture, and it didn't win. And a lot of people were very surprised. It lost to a movie named Crash, which I've also never seen. People were saying that the reason it didn't win was because of like homophobia within the Academy voters. So that's obviously like sort of that was the discourse around it. I don't know if that's true or not, but a lot of people saw that as like a big snub. Like they thought that it was going to win or that it deserved to win. So my most offensive snub, I think, is the fact that Toni Collette didn't get anything for her performance in Hereditary, because she was excellent in that movie and she didn't even get a nomination, which is wild. So I also looked into the actual statuette that obviously all of the winners receive. It's officially called the Academy Award of Merit, and it's a gold plated knight that is holding a sword and is standing on a film reel. It's about 13 inches tall and it weighs about 8.5 pounds. So it's got a little weight to it. And as a fun fact, during World War II, they were actually made of plaster because metal was scarce. The people that won in that time, they did go back later and get, exchange them for real metal ones, which is cool. In conclusion, I also was curious about like why the Oscars matter so much, because they really do seem to be like the end all be all for the film industry, at least definitely in the US. Like I feel like a lot of people's careers could revolve around, like not revolve around, but have that as like the big goal of their careers to receive an Oscar. And when it comes to art, it's a little hard when you have something like that, an institution or something that is like dictating what makes your art good or not good. And so I was like, why does it matter so much? Obviously it does. It matters in a very specific way, I think. The Oscars affect the kind of stories that get told through the film medium, which ones are taken seriously, and what the industry regards as like prestigious. Because obviously, if a movie wins an Oscar and it's a movie that tells a specific kind of story, then more movies like it will be created and be taken seriously. So in that way, it matters because it just holds a lot of prestige with both, I think, audience members and also the industry. Of course, there's also like the political side of it as well. Obviously, there are a lot of movies that have a lot more resources than others and can put a lot of those resources into campaigning for an Oscar nomination. So there's a lot of like politics. And also, like we talked about earlier, the voter demographics affect who wins, or who doesn't. And so with the whole Oscar so white thing, you can tell that like there was definitely a bias there, and it came across in the movies that were being nominated and like given a platform and everything. So it's not perfect by any means, and it has its flaws, but it seems to be the case that the industry altogether has agreed that like the Oscars are important for the reasons I mentioned. Like I think the thing that is important to remember is that the Oscars aren't necessarily awarding the best movies ever. I think they are awarding the best movies in that moment. I think that is sort of like the best way to see it. Is it doesn't mean that the movies that didn't get nominated aren't good. It's just like the ones that were nominated were the best in that moment, in that year, or whatever the time period is for when they get nominated. So yeah, I think the Oscars matter for some reasons. They also sort of don't, and I think both are kind of true. But that's it. That's my topic.
That was so interesting. I've always been curious about the Oscars and like where the name comes from and the history. So that was interesting.
Thank you. Okay, Joe, it's your turn. What are you going to talk about today?
Today, I'm going to tell you about Esperanto.
What?
Esperanto is a language It's what's called a conlang, which is short for constructed language. And so it's an artificial language that somebody invented. It's sort of the most successful conlang ever.
Wow. I've
Yeah.
never heard of it before.
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear more.
So Esperanto was invented by a man named L.L. Zamenhof. He was born in Poland. He was born in a city called Białystok, and this city has landed in different countries over recent history. So it's been in Poland, it's been in Prussia, Russia, back to Poland. Today it's in Poland. So it's maybe a Polish city, but part of the context that's relevant to this is that it's a very like multicultural city. Within the city there were, pockets of culture for Polish, Russian, German, and Jewish. And so Zamenhof was Jewish. And in his perspective, there was so much like conflict and strife. He was basically a humanist. So he wanted to bring peace to the world. And Esperanto, his motivation for it was this to bring about peace by introducing a new language that was nobody's first language. It was nobody's native language, so that everyone could talk in this language. He viewed language as like one of the means for strife to come about, from people having conflict over, whose language is better, who wants to speak, whose language are we going to adopt as like the language that we're all going to speak together. So he said instead, like, let's invent a new language, and then it's nobody's first language and we can all use it. So in 1887, he published the first book on Esperanto called Unua Libro, which means first book. And after he published the book, he immediately gave up the rights to it. So he published the book, but then he didn't hold on to the copyright because he wanted it to be public domain.
Even though Esperanto is supposed to be like a new kind of like neutral language, is it based on other languages? Because I know, like you said, Libro, and that sounds like Spanish, and even Esperanto sounds like Spanish. So is it like based in Spanish?
Yeah, so it is basically completely European in its origin. And so there's a lot of influence from Romance languages, so Spanish, Italian, French, and there's also a lot of influence from German and Greek. So he did intend it to be like an international language. An interesting fact is that English was a major influence on his design principles around Esperanto, primarily because of it being so simple, which is kind of a funny thing to read. But it makes sense when you think about the specific things about English that he found simple, which was conjugation and like tenses and this sort of stuff. In Latin languages, there's so many different forms of a word, but in English, you say like I went, he went, she went, they went, we went. There's just one word for all those different particular usages. Zamenhof believed in something called Homaranismo, which people basically translate to humanism. And this belief was just about, seeking the greatest good for humanity and world peace and all of this sort of stuff. And this is what motivated him to design Esperanto. And for his efforts in promoting this language, he did receive a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize 14 times, but he never won it.
So it reminds me of some movies we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
It's just
He
like that, just as important too.
he was snubbed. Yeah.
He was snubbed big time.
Yeah. Yeah. He always viewed this humanism as the primary focus of his life, as like the thing he was really focusing on, and Esperanto was secondary to that. It was just serving that ultimate goal. One time in 1906, he went to the World Congress in Geneva, and he was going to give a speech about Esperanto. And initially, his speech had a lot of stuff about Homaranismo in it, about his philosophy and sort of religious elements too. The French organizers of the World Congress warned him against including this like religious and philosophical stuff in his speech. So he ended up giving a very different speech that only focused primarily on breaking down walls between communities and emphasizing that Esperanto is only a language. So Esperanto as a language has been unusually successful compared to other conlangs. So there's one conlang in particular that I want to compare it to called Volapük. So Volapük was invented by this guy named Schleyer, Johann Martin Schleyer. He invented this language, and a lot of people started adopting it. A lot of people learned it. A really interesting thing about it that's very different is that he wanted to be in charge of it absolutely. So he had no flexibility in terms of like outside, like anybody besides him, like making changes to it or like who's going to be in charge of like organizing this language. You can't design it, the entire language. It has to develop naturally by people using it, and he didn't want to let go of it at all.
That seems weird because I feel like the nature of a language is that it evolves. Even though it may change, like it doesn't mean it's not the language anymore. You know what I mean? So it's kind of weird for him to want to like hold on to it and keep it like in its pure form or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and ultimately this ended up being the downfall for Volapük.
Also, not a very good name for a language,
Yeah.
if I may say so
Mm-hmm.
myself.
It reminds me of Wolfpick.
Yeah, cool name for a band.
Mm-hmm.
Weird name for language.
Yeah. Besides that, Schleyer took a lot of influence from Latin and German, ended up making the language very complicated. It had a lot of tenses, it had a lot of grammatical forms. These things together, along with the introduction of Esperanto, sort of killed Volapük pretty effectively. Really, because like people like Volapük speakers were sort of not very happy with the situation in general. It was complicated and hard to learn, so hard to bring in new people. And then Esperanto comes along, same basic idea, but much simpler. The guy gave up ownership over, and control over the language from the very beginning. So people basically jump ship and become Esperanto people. One of Zamenhof's goals was to have Esperanto adopted as an official international language, right? So, like an official language adopted by various organizations to be the language for international communications. It's never been completely adopted, but there have been some like pretty close, there have been some attempts. And so I'll tell you about some of those now. So the League of Nations is basically like the UN, but a long time ago. So the UN before the UN. So the delegate from Iran actually proposed to adopt Esperanto as an official language for international communications. And the committee that was supposed to vote on this consisted of 11 people, 11 representatives from different countries. 10 voted in favor of Esperanto. One country voted against it. No, it's not. It's not the U.S. It was, I guess, the U.S. of the League of Nations, which is France.
Interesting. For like snobby reasons, maybe?
I think that that's pretty fair to say. The French language, francophones, people from France, it has a very complex relationship with the rest of the world. We have the phrase lingua franca for a reason. Lingua franca means the language that we're all going to use, but obviously it literally means French language, right? And it's because French was the language that everyone used to communicate for a very long time. Today, English is the language that everyone uses to communicate. Like if you pick two random people out of the world and you try to make them talk to each other, they're most likely going to use English. And I think this is opinion. This is my personal opinion, what I've experienced from talking to people, is that there are some French people who are very bitter about this. They're very bitter that they used to have the dominant language of the world, and now English is the dominant language of the world. Now listen, I'm not the one that's going to sit here and like defend English as like the rightful heir to like being the international language or anything. I don't care.
That would be weird.
It's very convenient for me that I'm a native English speaker, but that's not where I'm planting my flag at all.
I don't know. It seems that way.
I I I do not care about English being the dominant language. I care even less about French being the dominant language. And so if French people are bitter about their language not being the dominant language anymore,
Wow.
it doesn't
We just lost all of our French listeners.
yeah, we did.
Damn.
Bye.
Au revoir. That's bye,
What is
right?
that? Huh?
Huh?
What? You
What?
mean goodbye?
Yes.
You
Au revoir.
you mean adios?
Yes. Or however you say it in Esperanto.
I should have learned some
You
Esperanto.
should have. That was going to be my next question. Do the rest of the episode in Esperanto.
Shit. So yeah, not only did France vote against it, so it was 10-1, France had veto power, which means it did not pass because of this one vote. And so it was not adopted. The argument in particular that the French delegate made was that if they adopted Esperanto as the international language, French and English would perish. So he's explicitly saying, like, these languages are the international languages. And so you're not going to step on our toes with this conlang.
So he's basically saying that Esperanto is better and could threaten English and French. So we could all be speaking Esperanto right now. For that delegate.
We could be.
Wow.
Besides rejecting this particular vote, France also took it a step further and banned Esperanto from being taught in French schools. So they were very bitter about it.
That's hater stuff.
That's some real hater stuff.
That's crazy.
Yeah. A bunch of other countries have also taken an interest in Esperanto, so I'm going to list them off for you now. So Brazil, Belgium, Chile, China, Colombia, Czechoslovakia, Haiti, Italy, Japan, India, Poland, Romania, South Africa have all made pushes for the League of Nations to adopt Esperanto in one way or another. So as much as I've been hating on French people, the French Academy of Sciences actually recommended Esperanto to be adopted as the international language for scientific communication. In 1924, the American Radio Relay League actually did adopt Esperanto as an official language for international beginners in radio, in amateur radio. I don't know if you knew, but like amateur radio used to be a big hobby that people would have. So they would have their own little radio transmitter and receiver in their garage or something, and they would radio communicate to people. So this is like pre internet. There was even a failed attempt to make an Esperanto state, like a country, a very small little one. So there's a place apparently called the Neutral Morisnet in somewhere in Central Europe, and they attempted to make that into an Esperanto speaking state. So here's two political related fun facts about Esperanto. Two major groups that hated it, the Nazis and the Soviets. So the Nazis are a much easier story to tell about this. Zamenhof was Jewish. A lot of the early adopters were Jewish. A lot of the people in charge were Jewish. Because that's Zamenhof. He's Jewish and that's where he came from. And that's enough for Nazis to say, like, this is a Jewish conspiracy to control the world or something like that. And so they attempted to ban it for their like prisoners, but apparently the prisoners would often just say that they were speaking Italian, and the German soldiers couldn't tell it was close enough. And Italy was an ally of Germany in World War II, so they were able to pass it off for a while. Eventually, they like caught on to that gimmick, and they started seriously going after and punishing Esperanto speakers. In particular, many of Zamenhof's own children. I mean, they were already Jewish, but like on top of that, they were being targeted specifically for being Esperantists. And yeah, they were imprisoned and killed. And actually, out of Zamenhof's entire family, only one of his grandchildren survived World War II. So why did the Soviets hate it? So initially, they really liked Esperanto. So, you know, a lot of the ideology of communists was sort of in alignment to some degree with the humanism that Zamenhof started off with. And so they actually referred to it as the Latin of the proletariat. What ended up happening, though, is due to the, like, authoritarian aspect of the Soviet regime, the Esperanto speakers were able to write letters to people outside of the Soviet sphere of influence in Esperanto and basically the censors were not able to catch a lot of details that were being transmitted. And so Esperanto speakers were able to get information outside of the Soviet world in a way that they did not like. Then they started cracking down on it. The Soviets started referring to Esperanto as a tool of Zionism and cosmopolitanism. I've never heard this term called cosmopolitanism, so I don't know what it refers to exactly, but I guess we can guess. And a lot of Esperantists in the Soviet, in Russia, ended up being put into labor camps and sent to Siberia and this sort of stuff until the Khrushchev thaw in the 50s. So there's actually today a lot of native Esperanto speakers. So how this usually comes to happen is that there are these annual meetings for Esperanto where people from all over the world come together to talk about Esperanto, to speak in Esperanto to each other, and have a good time. One thing that happens is that people meet and then they get married, right? So they're coming to these Esperanto meetings. They don't speak each other's native language at all, but they speak Esperanto, and so then they're able to communicate with each other. And so, like, people reported from the very first one that happened in 1905 that they were completely elated to be able to speak to a whole bunch of people that otherwise they would not be able to. So it was a really cool experience, I guess. But what happens is if these people are getting married, they don't speak each other's language, they speak Esperanto. Esperanto becomes the household language. So their kids grow up speaking Esperanto. And so there's native Esperanto speakers. There's even like third generation Esperanto speakers now. Some people say that this is actually sort of it's like ironic. It's counter to the original intention of Esperanto because the original intention is for it to be everybody's second language so that nobody feels like that attachment to it. And so then it doesn't cause people to fight about whose language is better or whatever. So today, the number is estimated to be about 2,000 people in the world that are native Esperanto speakers, and that those are members of 1,000 families. But besides the native speakers, there are a lot of non-native speakers. There's much more than the native speakers. So the numbers are very hard to estimate. I think a lot of people can attempt to learn Esperanto with the bar is pretty low. It was designed that way intentionally, obviously. And so it's hard to get accurate numbers, but the range is somewhere between 100,000 people and 2 million people. And so people say like the number is probably closer to the lower end of that range, but that's still a pretty significant population. And it's spoken all over the world. So it's recorded in 115 countries. The biggest areas being Europe generally, but also in Brazil. China actually has a lot of Esperanto speakers. So China actually, out of a lot of countries, they were the ones that sort of bought into it. I don't know about the most, but they bought into it a lot. So China has a significant portion of people who know Esperanto at least, and they teach it in some schools, and they even have like a museum of Esperanto in one of those schools. So one piece of drama happened. There was a delegation that was formed that was going to attempt to propose a official international language, and pretty much everyone thought that Esperanto was going to be a shoo-in for this. When the vote happened, basically an anonymous person at the last minute and against the rules slipped in another nomination, which is they called it Ido, which is actually the Esperanto word for offspring, and it's basically reformed Esperanto. Basically, their argument is to say that Esperanto needs to be reformed a lot, needs to be changed a lot, and we can't adopt Esperanto at this stage. We need to change it. And so they splintered off of Esperanto as a language and as a movement, and it's called Ido, and they basically the whole idea was to just like change it a lot. And so this undermined Esperanto being adopted in that situation, but it also splintered off a section of the community. But basically what happened is that it sort of ate itself a little bit by trying to change so much and so often that it couldn't get a foothold in any way, and it sort of died off on its own. So culturally, there have been over 25,000 books written in Esperanto. There's a lot of books, popular books from various languages that get translated into Esperanto, and they even have their own music and their own films, and you can learn Esperanto on Duolingo. And Facebook and Google have both officially recognized it as an option, a language.
That's awesome. I had no idea what Esperanto even was. So that sounds really neat. And it's also like cool to know that, I don't know, like another language that isn't the ones that already exist could become a thing, you know? The thing I kept thinking about is like when you're a little kid and you and your cousin make up a language. Hey, if you would have kept going, it could have become something like Esperanto.
Yeah, it could have.
How do you say that's the end of the episode in Esperanto?
Tio estas la fino de la episodio.
Nice. Thanks for sharing that. That was really interesting. I kind of want to like look it up on Duolingo now. Maybe
Yeah.
we can learn together.
Yeah, we could learn
And
Esperanto.
that I feel like that would be a good language to know, to like learn with a friend, to like talk shit about people.
Yeah, except if they know Spanish, they might know like 50%
Yeah,
of the
actually,
words.
that's true. Still. So that's going to be it for today's episode. We hope you guys enjoyed it.
Make sure to listen to all of our episodes and subscribe to everything and click on the bell and click on the like and leave a
Nice.
comment and
What else?
share it with other people, and also just send us money. You can just email us a check.
Email us a check.
I meant mail us a check, but email us a check is pretty
Just
funny.
a picture of a check.
Yeah, I mean Zelle, Venmo,
Right.
Venmo
down below.
cash.
Follow us on Instagram. We're at brainworms_pod. As Joe said, subscribe on YouTube. Subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. I'm sure you can find us there. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.